Hi and welcome to this series where I go through the ITIL 4 practices individually and I'll give you the main headline points you need to be aware of, all about building your base knowledge around ITIL 4. I'll also be discussing some of my real world application of this practice in organisations. Don't forget, please subscribe to my channel, click the bell to get those updates. Okay, so let's get to it. Today I'm going to be covering off change control or change enablement from the service management practice. There's 17 practices altogether, and I'm just going to be covering the change control, change enablement practice. I've done other videos that will cover those other practices off. So a reminder, a practice is a set of organizational resources designed for performing work or for accomplishing an objective. So straight out the gate, change control, change enablement. ITIL 3, one of the differences between ITIL 3 and ITIL 4 is the terminology. So the change management name has changed. There's this change enablement practice. To be fair, in the ITIL Foundation book, there is reference to change control. But let's use those two words interchangeably for the moment. So a change is defined in ITIL 4 as an addition, a modification, a removal of anything that could have a direct or an indirect effect on service. You don't always know what's going to have an indirect effect, of course. Side note here really around change, there is a difference between organisational change management, which is about people, the human aspect. It's more human orientated, and that's from the general management practice. This is something different. So the organisational change management is people focused. The change and change enablement practice, part of the service management practice, that's talking around infrastructure and change advisory board type activities. Scope in terms of this practice, usually around IT infrastructure, your applications, documentation is a good idea to make sure documents and standard operating procedures and other documentation generally is subject to change control. Processes especially, relationships as well, basically anything that could potentially impact service one way or another. Change control is always a balance between the benefit of that change versus the risk. I'll come on to that in a few moments. You may also hear the term change authority and think, what's that all about? So change authority is usually a group, or certainly in a lot of organisations I've worked in, it's an individual, it's a person who actually authorises change. So if we look at change control, change enablement and the different types, you may be familiar with change advisory boards or change control generally. It's usually split out into three areas. You've got a standard change, you've got a normal change, and then you have an emergency change. So if we just dig a little deeper into each one of those. So a standard change, perhaps it's a patch, or maybe dynamically adding some more memory, or dynamically adding some more storage, or replacing a PC, a computer, a printer, or a general kind of break fix type activity. These standard changes typically are routine, they're low risk, they've been pre-authorized, they've been pre-approved, and they're activities that happen on a regular basis. They're well understood, they're well documented, and don't need additional authorization. They usually need a risk assessment and authorization only during the creation phase or modification due to a business change. My personal preference around standard change requests from first-hand experiences, I like to see 3 successful changes go through CAB before it can be proposed as a candidate for a standard change. That's just a personal preference, but I like to make sure that that change that is being sold to me as a standard change, my question is, how many times have we done this before? X. How many times have we done it before and there's been no impact whatsoever? It's not suddenly generated loads of incidents. As long as it's happened before on a regular basis and it's not generating lots of incidents or problems or additional activity, I'm happy to propose candidates for standard change. It's usually in a production environment. I have seen in other organisations standard changes being put in place for development or for QA or for UAT, but typically, and this is the same for the normal change and emergency changes, usually it's the production environment we're talking about. In the case of standard change, quite often I see them come through as service requests initially, but it can also be an operational change of some kind. I thought a really good quote I saw a while ago is about standard change. It gives you the license to operate, to do things, but it doesn't give you the permission to change whatever, whenever. So just have that at the back of your mind as to a standard change. It's a low risk, it's pre-authorized, it's pre-approved, it's been done before, it's well understood. Let's move on to the second type of change. That's a normal change. So that could be something like an upgrade of something or a configuration change, maybe to a firewall or an addition of some kind, additional rule or additional server or whatever it may be, or decommissioning or commissioning something. So normal change request typically must follow the change management process. So normal changes are categorized, and you'll see changes being categorized by risk and impact to the company that you're working for or your customer. So a minor change, as an example, you would expect it to be, well, it's not very risky and the impact is not much. So a minor change would be classed as low risk and low impact. Or something that is a significant change, you might expect the risk to be, well, it's not low for sure, but perhaps it's not high. So maybe it's a medium risk level and impact. And then clearly a major change, something significant, something big. You would expect in your ITSM tool to be categorizing that as this is a high risk, this is high impact. And a lot of service management tools, I'm quite familiar with ServiceNow, but there's a whole ton of other ITSM tools out there. But you can categorize your risk in the change management module. So a normal change, it needs to be scheduled, it needs to be assessed, it needs to be authorized following the process. So things like scheduling, questions that usually come out is, does it need to be done during business hours? Does it need to be done at month end? Is that a good time to do it? Can we not wait till month end is over, for example? And the assessment of the change as well. I've certainly seen in other organisations where low level changes, for example, might only require a local team or a supervisor authorization, while something that is very significant may need a different level of board authorization. And you would expect a change request to be initiated as part of a normal change request. And then emergency change, so as the name suggests, this is something that needs looking at now. So perhaps the service or a product's not available. It must be implemented as soon as possible. It has to be put into place to recover service. Usually it's not following the same process as a normal or obviously a standard change, but they need that level of quick implementation. Scheduling and documentation isn't quite so much as a priority. That in organisations I've worked in, there may be an ECAB team, there may be a team of senior execs that are involved, or senior management that are on that emergency change committee, and they'll get an email to say, look, we need to do this and we need to do it now. And that change authority typically is separate from your standard change authority or your normal change practice. Clearly, you don't want to be seeing a lot of emergency changes, and it's a particular bugbear of mine that I think sometimes emergency change requests are compensating bad planning. So some people try to use these to bypass the system, to bypass the change board, that governance board, and it's just a case of, oh no, look, I want to do it really quickly, and I've heard the word emergency change, so I'll say this is an emergency. There's a difference between emergency and it needs to be done quickly. I've worked for a CIO in a large organisation that particularly liked to see the volume of emergency changes going through, because there was a direct correlation to bad planning and emergency changes. So let's just dig a little deeper in terms of change control and change enablement. So communication is really important when it comes to change, and I found a RACI matrix quite helpful in terms of just understanding who are the people that that need to be informed, for example, or who's in that communication or matrix of being consulted about particular areas. But regardless of who a change authority is, you still need to communicate widely across an organisation. You need to speak to stakeholders. That might be business units, it might be individuals, it might be departments, it might be countries, it might be the EMEA region, it may be the APAC region, it may be the US region. Wherever it is, you need to think about your stakeholders in terms of change and comms, making sure that all those people are aware of it, to avoid any surprises. Service desk as a function as well need to be aware of changes. Don't forget the service desk, because if a change goes out and somebody's not quite clear on something, you don't want to be in the situation where the person phones the service desk function and the agent on the service desk isn't familiar with what's happened, if it's been upgraded, or there's an extra box that's appeared or an extra menu option or whatever it is. Don't just think about your communication mechanism to your stakeholders externally in terms of customers. Think about your own internal functions as well, and service desk is a really good idea to involve. So let's just talk about the service value chain while we're talking about change enablement and change management. Like with most of the practices, there's a level of involvement in all of the activities. So in terms of planning, improving, engaging, designing, transitioning, obtaining, building, delivering and support. For change management, that's no different. It's involved in all of those stages. There's a particular nod in terms of level of involvement around design and transition, naturally, obtaining and building, delivering and supporting and improving. So if we look at design and transition as an example, a lot of changes are initiated as the result of something different has happened, something's been updated, something's new, somewhere along the line there's been a change to that service, and change enablement is a major contributor to the transition element of design and transition. And then the obtain and build. So if we just think that through, obtaining something or building something, clearly change to any kind of configuration item, any kind of service, any kind of product, of course it's going to be subject to change enablement, whether it's a third-party service that you've obtained externally, or even if it's an in-house, you've developed it and designed it and built it in-house. So the main nod really in terms of change management and change enablement is around the design and transition, obtain and build, deliver and support and improve. That's not to say plan and engage isn't involved as well. So a quick discussion around roles as well. So earlier on, I did a session on the competency profiles. So ITIL talks about using 5 role competency profiles. So you have a leader profile, you have an administrator, you have a coordinator stroke communicator, you have a methods and technique expert, or a tech expert, a techie, a subject matter expert. And each one of those profiles, so the leader, for example, is a decision maker, someone involved in delegating, overseeing activities, motivational, evaluation of outcomes, whereas a tech expert is clearly someone who's a technical expert, they're a subject matter expert, they've been involved in assignments, they deal with technical work and resolution. In ITIL, you have the different role profiles. So if we think of change management and change enablement, you may well have heard of a change manager, someone who's responsible for managing all of those changes and making sure that those changes deliver value, but at the same time minimizing any kind of disruption to a business. So perhaps in this case you could say a good role competency profile for a change manager may be a TMA. So a technical expert for the T, M in terms of methods and techniques, and then A in terms of administration experience. So that's not set in stone, but it just makes you kind of think in the widest context of change enablement and change management. Who are the roles? You will have clearly heard a change manager mentioned. Okay, so just the final slide really, and final points to ponder, things to think about. Change. Make sure the risk has been properly assessed. Make sure it's authorized, and look at managing a schedule of some kind. Make sure at its most basic sense, if there's two changes, are they occurring at the same time, and is there a risk that they're happening at the same time, that perhaps you can't, if someone's doing a network change for the sake of argument and somebody's doing a server change, does that mean actually if the network's down you can't connect to the server? Probably, but think about a change schedule. The change management practice, it helps reduce the number of unauthorized changes, so it's reducing that risk for you, so it's a good thing. Think about maximizing successful changes and at the same time reducing the number of unauthorized changes. So you're very much in that risk space of assessing, authorizing activities in a controlled way. And there are governance boards, change advisory boards, change authorities, and you have a structure of different types of changes. I covered standard changes, normal changes, and emergency type changes. The final point around communication really and reporting. As I think through the last 25 years or so, I've been involved in this practice. There's certainly a number of reports I've been involved in generating and having various levels of responsibility and accountability for. But the emergency change report is always something that sticks out in my mind, and it goes back to looking at emergency changes and analysing them, and even if it's just a monthly report that says how many emergency changes have we had this month, and then really looking through those, because there are emergency changes, of course there are emergency changes, but I think sometimes it's abused for it's an excuse for bad planning, it's an excuse for just not wanting to follow the process and the governance around it, or people just forget and they just revert to old ways. So the emergency cab report I like to look at, I like to understand, because I think it teases out other points as to, are these really emergency changes? Other types of reports I quite like to see is the headline numbers, how many normal, how many standard, how many emergency changes have we had for the month, how many have been approved, but also interestingly how many have been rejected. It's quite interesting if you run a report and you look at it and go, yeah, we seem to approve absolutely everything. Is that a good thing? I don't think so. I think there needs to be a level of kind of teeth with this, in terms of, don't just assume you're coming to cab and it will get approved. There needs to be proper diligence, proper thought through this governance board. and producing a report that shows the number of rejected changes is quite an interesting control mechanism. I also like to see by business area or by function, so perhaps by network or by DB team or by application, where are these changes happening? Other good metrics, and I've certainly seen this in terms of KPIs, is reduction in numbers of unauthorized changes, the number in the backlog from an agile perspective, how many changes were successful versus how many changes were unsuccessful, number of incidents post change, perhaps changes performed during business hours or non-business hours are also other areas worth of interest. So please subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll continue to post and you'll get updates. Thank you. Bye.